My name is Lily Whitaker. People who know me would describe my life as unremarkable. I had a good job in art curation, a nice home, and a second marriage that lasted for 10 years until my husband died. I thought I knew the people closest to me and myself. But then I found myself trapped outside of Twin Falls with Nate. He was the kid from my husband's first marriage. We hadn't spent much time together over the years. Nate was distant, and I thought I respected that. But after his father died, he asked me to help him organize some of his dad's stuff. I said yes, not thinking too much about it. I figured it would only take a few hours. I didn't think I had any other commitments. I didn't want to take on any new projects after my husband's death. The problem started on Route 84. There was an unusual grinding sound coming from the engine, and the car shook. Then, there was silence. There was no signal, and there was no roadside cafe in sight. We were just the two of us and the empty, wide road. We found a place that has been around for a long time, but it's still popular new endeavors. The problem started on Route 84. There was an unusual grinding sound coming from the engine, and the vehicle shook. Then there was silence. There was no signal, and there was no roadside cafe in view. There was only the two of us and the empty, wide road. We found a place that has had better days, but it still has customers. I thought it would be a one-night problem, a small problem in the big picture. But hours turned into days, and the long wait started to affect us both. The hotel's strange quiet started to affect me at that moment. Edgar appeared, an old man with a strong, somewhat rude way of starting conversations. He said he knew Nate, too. I thought it would be just for one night, but it turned into days. The waiting made us both uncomfortable, and the hotel's strange quiet started to affect me. Edgar was an old man who was very pushy and a bit rude. He asked about Nate, and he said things about my stepson that I didn't like. It felt like someone close to me was more of a stranger than I had ever thought. Looking back, I wonder if something bad was going to happen when we got to the old, empty motel. I started to think about all parts of my life, my choices, and especially the young. He said things about my stepson that I found hard to believe. It felt like someone close to me was more of a stranger than I had ever thought. Looking back, I wonder if our lives were already decided when we went into the old, empty motel. I started to question everything about my life, my choices, and especially the young guy I thought was my son. I never thought that stillness could be so hard. The wide road has always made me feel better, but it felt strange to sit in the passenger seat next to Nate in the quiet car. He didn't say much, except for a few polite talks. I would look at him sometimes to see how he was feeling. He seemed busy. I never thought that being still could be so hard. The wide road has always made me feel better, but it felt strange to sit in the passenger seat next to Nate in the quiet car. He didn't say much, except for a few polite conversations. I would look at him to see if he was feeling good. He seemed busy, thinking about things I didn't know about. Natalie has always been a mystery. When he married his father, Hal, he was already in his early 20s. He was a thoughtful young man who never went to family gatherings. But he would sometimes visit her, and I often felt like an outsider in their talks. My relationship with Hal was full of joy, and he was thinking about something, but I didn't know what. Natalie has always been mysterious. After his father Hal got married, he was in his early 20s. He was a thoughtful young man who never went to family gatherings. But he would sometimes visit Hal. I often felt like an outsider in their conversations. My relationship with Hal was full of joy and ease, but my relationship with his son Nate was difficult and distant. It was like he was on another planet. Maybe that's why I agreed to help him with his property problems. I thought it might be a way to connect with him, even if it was late. Also, he said during one of his last moments of clarity that he wanted me to take care of Nate. I had a difficult relationship with Nate, his son. I was quiet about it, but I did help him with his property. I thought that we could connect, but it didn't work out. He also said that I should take care of Nate when he was alive. I agreed, but it was hard. It was like trying to hold on to something that was moving away from you. We drove for a long time, and we didn't say much. We only heard the radio, and Nate changed the station sometimes. I didn't care about being quiet. I had agreed to take care of someone who wanted to stay away, and it felt like trying to hold on to something you can't grasp. So, we ended up on the open road, and Salt Lake City started to feel far away. We drove for hours, almost without saying a word, except for the quiet radio that Nate would turn on now and then. I didn't care about the silence. It had never bothered me, but then the car started making an odd, strange noise. It was quiet at first, barely noticeable, but then it got louder and louder, like a low, grinding sound. Nate looked at me, his eyebrows all wrinkled, and he asked, "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, I heard it," I said, tightening my grip on the steering wheel. "The engine seems to be having some problems." We stopped. I hadn't been bothered by it before, but suddenly the car started making an odd, trembling sound. It started subtly at first, almost too quiet to hear, but then it quickly got louder and sounded like something was grinding. Nate looked at me, his eyebrows scrunched up, and asked, "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, I definitely heard it," I replied, tightening my grip on the steering wheel. "It seems like the engine is having some trouble." I stopped by the side of the road, thinking it was just a small issue. But when Nate opened the car's hood, he didn't look confident. The engine made a horrible noise and smelled like something was burning. It looked like we needed a lot of work to fix it. "It looks like we need a new part," Nate said, looking at his phone. He shook his head and said, "There's no service in this area." We looked at the long road in front of us. Nate looked at the engine. It was making a loud noise, and there was a bad smell. It looked like we needed a new part. He looked at his phone. There was no service here. We looked at the road. It was empty, and there were mountains. "Let's walk," I said. I didn't want to look weak. After 30 minutes, we saw a sign for a dirt road. It said Elmwood 3 miles ahead. We looked at each other. The Elmwood Inn was a place that seemed forgotten by time. It was better than having no place to stay. An old weathered sign was hanging over a road. We decided to walk, even though it was hard to find the road because there were no cars. After 30 minutes, we saw a sign that said Elmwood 3. We looked at each other. The Elmwood Inn looked like it was from another time. It was better than not having a place to stay at all. The old building had a sign on it. It was made of wood, and it was covered in dust. It looked old. Now, it was falling apart. There was peeling paint and dust on the windows. When we went in, a bell rang. There was a man behind the desk, but he did not look at us. He looked a little familiar, but I did not know him. The story structure looked old and worn out. It had peeling paint and dusty windows. When we went in, a bell rang. There was a guy behind the desk. He looked up when he heard us. He looked kind of familiar, but I didn't know where I had seen him. He smiled at us, but it didn't look friendly. He sounded tired. He said he didn't have a car. He said he hadn't spoken in days. I said, "Okay, please." Our car broke down when we were near there. The guy agreed. He held out his hand for the keys on the counter. There weren't many people there. He didn't look like he had been there for a long time. He had a strange look on his face, like he was nervous or something. He gave us the keys to a room, and his eyes stayed on Nate for a long time. It was weird. He said hi, but I didn't understand why. Nate just shrugged and didn't look at me. We took the keys and left. We went to the room. It was quiet, and there was a bed, a dresser, and a small television that didn't seem to be used for a long time. I tried to relax, but I felt uneasy. The room felt too quiet, like it was waiting for something to happen. That night, I stayed awake and heard soft sounds coming from outside the thin walls. I thought it was probably just the wind or the usual noises of an old building, but then I heard Nate's voice talking quietly. That night, I stayed up and heard some quiet sounds coming from outside. I thought it was probably just the wind or something like that, but then I heard Nate talking to someone. I was really curious, so I got out of bed and crept over to the door. I put my ear to it, and I could hear Nate and someone else. It was hard to hear, but I could tell they were talking. The first voice was Nate's, and the second one was talking to him. I was curious, so I got out of bed and quietly went to the door. I put my ear to the door and listened. I could barely hear Nate and someone else talking. They were both quiet, so I couldn't tell what they were saying. Then, they both stopped talking. I listened for a while, but I couldn't hear anything. Then, I heard Nate's footsteps coming closer to the door. I went back to bed and pretended to be asleep. Nate opened the door and came into the room. He stopped and looked around. I could tell he was nervous. Then, he sat down on the bed. The next morning, Nate was still asleep. Something else happened, too. They didn't say much. I felt like Eve was trying to be kind but dismissive. Nate's footsteps got closer. I went back to bed, pretending to be asleep. He came into the room, and I felt like he was staring at me. He looked upset and worried. Then he finally lay down on his side. The next morning, Nate was more shy. He was still distant, but he also looked worried. I thought about asking him about our conversation, but I didn't. Maybe I was scared to know what he would say. Or maybe I was just worried that I didn't really know him after all this time. He was more reserved, and he looked a little uncomfortable. I thought about asking him about our conversation, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Maybe I was scared of what he would say, or maybe I just didn't want to admit that I didn't know him that well. The same guy from the night before came to our table in the lobby. He said his name was Edgar and sat down. He asked Nate if he was planning to stay for a while, and Nate smiled and said that they were just waiting for the car's maintenance. I tried to be nice, but I also tried to make it clear that I wasn't too interested in talking about it. The man from the night before came to the lobby. He introduced himself as Edgar and sat down in a seat across from us. He asked if we planned to stay for a while, and smiled when he saw Nate. I said that we were just waiting for the car's maintenance, trying to sound kind but dismissive. Edgar laughed softly while looking at Nate. It's funny how fate works, isn't it? It brings people together in the most unexpected places. I felt a chill run down my spine. Are you two familiar with him? I said, unable to hold back my curiosity any longer. Nate's face went blank, and his jaw clenched. We've met before, he said. Edgar laughed softly while looking at Nate. Isn't it interesting how fate brings people together in the most unexpected places? I felt a chill run down my spine. Are you familiar with that feeling, too? I asked, unable to hold back my curiosity any longer. Nate's face went blank, and he clenched his jaw. We've met, he said briefly, not allowing me to ask more questions. Edgar, not bothered by Nate's cold response, casually shrugged. It's a small world, he said, sitting back in his chair. Or maybe it's just how things are meant to happen. I wasn't sure what to think. Edgar left quickly after an unsettling. Edgar paused for a moment, then left, leaving Nate speechless. I looked at him, expecting him to explain, but he didn't. He was focused on his coffee, as if it could answer all his questions. As we prepared for another night at the inn, I decided to walk around. The environment was calm, and the night air was cool. The stars shone brightly in the sky. I stopped and looked at Nate, expecting him to explain something. But he didn't say anything. He just looked at his coffee, like it had all the answers. As we got ready for another night at the inn, I decided to walk around. It was a calm night, and the air was cold. The stars looked brightly in the sky, but it was hard to see because of the clouds. I felt uneasy, like something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As I got closer to the lobby, I saw Edgar sitting against the front desk. He was looking at me when I came in. I tried to be careful, but Mrs. Whitaker told me to be careful. I felt uneasy. I was lying in bed, looking at the ceiling, when I felt like something was wrong, even though I didn't know what it was. Nate was keeping secrets. I knew that, but I also felt uneasy. I felt like something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I went to the lobby, and I saw Edgar sitting against the front desk. He was looking at me when I came in. I tried to be careful, but it was hard. He looked at me like he was hiding something. I blinked, and then I looked away. I shrugged, and I smiled at me, but it didn't make me feel better. I went back to our room, and I started thinking about what was going on. I wanted to talk to Nate, but I wasn't sure if I should. The mood was dark and heavy. I looked at my watch. It was not quite 7:00. I looked out the window. I saw the motel's small neon sign flickering. I smiled at the memory of Nate's warning. I felt confused and worried. I went back to our room. I wanted to talk to Nate. I wanted to know the truth, but I was also afraid. I lay in bed and looked at the ceiling. I felt like Nate was hiding something. I knew he was keeping secrets. But I also knew that I would have to tell someone the truth. I would have to tell Nate the truth. The next morning, I woke up and noticed that Nate was already gone. His bed was made, and his suitcase was gone. I looked at my watch. It was not quite 7 o'clock, and I looked out the window, but I didn't see him. I only saw the motel's small neon sign, which was flickering. The next morning, I woke up and saw that Nate was already gone. His bed was made, and his suitcase was not in the corner of the room. I looked at my watch. It was not quite 7:00. I looked out the window, but I did not see him. I only saw the motel's small neon sign, which was flickering. I got dressed quickly. I felt annoyed and worried that he had gone to check the car. A quiet voice in my head said that this was not likely. After all, he had not said what he was going to do, and he had not given any important information. I found Edgar and I got up early in the morning and got ready. I was confused, but I didn't say anything. I asked, "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker. Have you seen Nate?" Edgar was in the dining room, not in the living room, making himself a cup of coffee. He looked at me as though he had infinite time. His eyes had the same strange warmth from the night before. I asked, trying to sound calm. "He got up early in the morning," Edgar said, drinking his coffee. "He said he had some business in town." I repeated, confused. "What kind of business?" Edgar asked, although his eyes showed he knew something. "You have to ask him." I asked, trying not to sound interested. "He got up early in the morning," Edgar said, drinking his coffee. "He said he had some business in town." I asked, confused, "What kind of business?" He shrugged, but his eyes showed he knew something. "You should ask him, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had to do with his return here." This made me stop. "Are you saying he has already been to this place?" Edgar smiled a little, but I didn't notice. I looked at him more quickly, but he didn't say anything. "Are you saying that he has already been here?" Nate interrupted, his voice a hint of disbelief. Edgar's smile, faint and unsettling, faltered. He didn't respond, choosing instead to look out the window. But secrets in a family often resurface. The words hung in the air, unspoken. Nate was about to ask more when Boeing came in, his arrival accompanied by a rush of cold morning air. His eyes shifted rapidly between Edgar and me, and Edgar's uneasy expression revealed his unease. Nate entered, and Edgar looked up. He seemed surprised. Nate said, "Good morning, Edgar. I see you're up early." Edgar lifted his cup to his lips in a weak toast. Nate's jaw clenched as he stood next to his stepmother. "I believe she can handle a loan without further discussion, Nate," he said, inspecting the situation. Nate looked at the car and said, "They're waiting for a part, so we'll be here for at least one more day." Nate's tone made it clear that I should stop asking questions, so I went up and got my things. But I could still feel the tension between him and his stepmother. The man and Edgar were clearly uncomfortable with each other. I could tell because they wouldn't look at each other and their voices had this distant tone. Then, I decided to go to the next town over. I thought maybe it would help me think the town was calm, but also a little spooky. There weren't many people there. I decided to go to the nearby town to clear my head. The town was calm, but a bit spooky, with only a few shops along the main street. I went to a cafe and got a coffee, sitting by the window to wait. A few minutes later, a woman in her 60s sat down at the table next to mine. She had sharp eyes and seemed to be asking a lot of questions. "You're not from around here, are you?" I was at a cafe on the main street when I saw a woman come in. She seemed to be around 60. She was looking at me, and I could tell she was curious. "You're not from around here, are you?" she said. I told her that I was just passing through, but my stepson and I got stuck here because of a car problem. She looked at the motel sign on the window. "You're staying at the Elmwood?" she said. I felt a little uneasy when she asked. "You know the place." "Everyone in town knows the Elmwood," she said, smiling slightly. "It's been here forever, and Edgar, he's practically part of the scenery." She paused, studying me carefully. You say you're here with your stepson, Nate? He's in town for a bit of family business. Everyone in town knows the Elmwood. It's been here forever, and Edgar, well, he's practically part of the scenery. She paused, studying me carefully. You say you're here with your stepson, Nate? Yes, I'm here with him. He's in town for a bit of family business. Her expression shifted slightly. She nodded. Her gaze turned back to her coffee. It must be nice having family to lean on. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Instead, I sipped my coffee and glanced out the window. But the woman's words lingered in my mind. There was something in her tone, something that hinted. Her expression changed slightly. She nodded, then looked back at her coffee. It must be nice having family to lean on. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Instead, I drank my coffee and looked out the window, but I couldn't stop thinking about what the woman had said. There was something in her tone, something that hinted at knowledge she wasn't sharing. When I returned to the inn, I found Nate pacing in our room. His expression was a mixture of frustration and anxiety. He looked up as I entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. Where were you? He asked, his tone sharper than I had expected. I went for a walk into town, I replied, taken aback. I was surprised by Nate's reaction. He looked upset and anxious. He was pacing in our room. Where were you? He asked angrily. I went for a walk into town, I replied, taken aback by his reaction. Why? He asked, shaking his head and running a hand through his hair. I just didn't see you when I got back. Are you all right? He asked, genuinely concerned. You've been on edge ever since we arrived, he continued. I just don't like being here, he said, before I could ask him to. He looked tense. He stood in the doorway, looking at Nate in a way that made me uncomfortable. Where were you? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. Nate, I thought you'd want to know. The mechanic just called. Your car should be ready by tomorrow afternoon. Nate took a deep breath. I'm fine, he said. He gave me a long, hard look. Sorry to interrupt, but the mechanic just called. Your car should be ready by tomorrow afternoon. I felt a wave of relief, but Nate's expression remained tense. Edgar lingered in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Nate in a way that made me uncomfortable. Well, he said, Finn, where were you located? I just thought you'd want to update after he left. Nate let out a long breath as if he'd been holding it the entire time. Nate, I said quietly, is there something? Edgar was still nervous. He stood in the doorway and looked at Nate. His eyes showed that he was uncomfortable. Where were you? Edgar asked. I thought you'd want to know after he left, Nate said. He took a deep breath, as if he'd been holding it the whole time. Is there something going on between you and Edgar? He asked. Nate looked at me. It's complicated, he said. I'd like to understand. You've been acting strange ever since we got here, and Edgar seems to know you better than I do, I replied, choosing my words carefully. For a moment, he looked like he might tell me something. His eyes softened. Edgar and I have been acting strangely ever since we got here. Is it okay if I ask if you know each other better than I do? It's complicated. Is it okay? His head as if dismissing the thought, just let it go. Lily, he said. His tone was final. It's not something you need to worry about. I wanted to protest, to demand an explanation, but something in his voice stopped me. This wasn't the time, not yet. That night, I lay awake, thinking about the events of the past few days. I was confused. I thought about how Edgar seemed familiar with Nate, and how everyone in the town seemed to know him. It was like I was trying to put together a puzzle, but I wasn't getting it. At midnight, I heard Nate get out of bed. I watched as he put on his shoes and left the room. The door closed quietly behind him. I felt curious. And after a moment, I followed him, keeping my distance. He went down the dark hallway, exited through a side door, and walked toward the edge of the property where Edgar was waiting. They spoke in low voices, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of. He looked at me, and after a moment, I followed him, keeping my distance. He went down the hallway, and I watched as he walked to the edge of the property, where Edgar was waiting. They spoke quietly, their faces lit up by a nearby street light. I crept closer, trying to hear their conversation. "You're making a mistake," Edgar said angrily. "This isn't going to end the way you think." Nate's voice was also angry. "Don't have a choice, everyone has a choice," Nate said angrily. "Don't act." I crept closer to hear their conversation. "You're making a mistake." Edgar's tone was cold and angry. "This isn't going to end the way you think." Nate's voice was equally tense. "Don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. Don't act like a martyr. We both know what you're really after." Nate clenched his fists. His voice was barely a whisper. "Just stay out of it, Edgar. This is between me and her." I froze. A chill ran down my spine. Who was he talking about? Who was she? Before I could process what I'd heard, Edgar looked up. Nate clenched his fists. "This is between me and her. Stay out of it, Edgar." I froze. Who was he talking about? Who was she? Edgar looked up, his gaze cutting through the darkness and landing directly on me. His lips curled into a twisted smile. Well, he said. His voice dripped with mock amusement. "Seems we have company." Nate transformed his face into a blend of astonishment and fury. "Lily, what brings you here?" I recoiled, seeing my face redden. I was unable to sleep. I perceived voices. Edgar let out a deep, ominous chuckle that echoed through the night. "Curiosity may pose significant risks. Mrs. Whitaker, are you not familiar with that saying?" Nate's demeanor softened a little, but a trace of irritation remained in his eyes. He instructed him to return indoors as he grasped my arm and Edgar let out a deep, scary laugh. It echoed through the night. "Mrs. Whitaker, are you not familiar with that saying?" Nate's attitude softened a little, but he still looked a little annoyed. He told him to go back inside with me, and he held my arm to lead me back to our room. I felt scared. I didn't understand the story, and Nate wouldn't tell me anything, which made things worse. When we got back to our room, he closed the door quietly. I felt uneasy as I returned to our room. I couldn't understand some parts of the story, and Nate wouldn't tell me anything, which made things worse. He closed the door quietly. He looked at me, and I could see he was worried and sad. I asked him what was going on, but he only looked at me. I couldn't tell him what I wanted to know. I wanted to ask him more, but I didn't want to push him. He looked tense and upset. He spoke to himself, not to me. "He didn't want you to find out the truth." I tried to ask him about it, but he wouldn't tell me. I felt like something bad was happening, but I didn't know what. That night, I lay in bed and felt like there was something bigger and badder happening than I knew. After that night, things changed. Nate and I were no longer on the same page. He was acting closed off, his eyes were glazed over, and his voice was tight with worry. Even his body language showed he was always on edge. "What are you doing here?" Each step he took brought him closer to something bad. Nate and I were growing apart. He was becoming more closed off, his eyes were glazed over, and he spoke in a tight voice as if he were always watching. Even his posture was different, with his shoulders hunched down. "Why are you here?" Each step he took brought him closer to something bad that was going to happen soon. There were only a few hours left until the car was expected to be ready, and the idea of leaving Elmwood felt like an escape. I held on to that hope, but the feeling of escape was short-lived as we waited for news from the mechanic in the lobby. Edgar came over, his eyes shining with a familiar smile. He asked, there were only a few hours left before the car was expected to be ready, and the idea of leaving Elmwood felt like an escape. I kept that feeling, but it didn't last long. We were waiting for news from the mechanic in the lobby. Edgar came over to us, smiling in a way that made it clear he was teasing. "Are you planning to leave so soon, Nate?" he asked angrily. "We are finished here." Edgar laughed softly. "Do you believe change is inevitable? Certain things stay the same, even if you're far away." Nate's hands clenched tightly, and for a moment, I saw something. Nate smiled at the words, "You planning to leave so soon?" in a way that made it clear he didn't like the idea. "We are finished here." Edgar laughed softly. "Do you believe change is inevitable? Certain aspects persist regardless of distance. Nate's hands clenched tightly. For a moment, I perceived a glimpse of something. It resembled worry. I intended to intervene to alleviate the tension, but something restrained me. I perceived that there was more to this than I could comprehend, and my intuition urged me to be still and attentive. It is only a question of time, Nate Edgar proceeded, his tone kind yet imbued with threat. Perpetual concealment is unattainable. Nate appeared poised to reply. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on why. Nate seemed to sense my unease, and he looked at me. He seemed upset, and he whispered to me to go outside when we were alone. He breathed heavily and looked angry. I asked him what was wrong, but he didn't answer. He looked away, and his jaw tightened. He said that it was just an old problem that he was still dealing with. He looked away, muttering to himself. He gestured for me to go outside. Once we were away from Edgar, he breathed heavily and looked upset. What was that about? I asked, unable to stop wondering. He hesitated, looking away, and his jaw tightened. It's just an old grudge, he said. I understood the seriousness of what he was saying. Nate, you can't keep excluding me. You act like you're carrying a heavy burden, and Edgar acts like he knows what's going on with you. Nate groaned and looked down, and I didn't understand. It's complicated, Lily. I felt angry and upset. Nate, you can't keep excluding me. It's like you're carrying a heavy burden, and Edgar acts like he knows what you're going through. Nate groaned and looked down, and I didn't understand why it's complicated, Lily. I have done things I'm not proud of. I came here to move on, but Edgar won't stop. I tried to make him tell the truth, but his eyes showed he was in pain. This was clearly something he felt strongly about, and he had hidden it for a reason I may never understand. I wanted answers, but I knew that pushing him now would only push him away. We need to focus on getting out of here. He finally said, quietly, once we leave, none of this will matter. I agreed, trying to hide my own worries, but I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wouldn't be as simple as he thought. An hour later, we were back in the lobby, waiting for the mechanic. Suddenly, Edgar came back, looking serious. The cars are ready, he said, throwing a pair of keys on the counter. You can pick one. Nate grabbed them. I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wouldn't be as simple as he thought. An hour later, we went back to the lobby. We were waiting for the mechanic's call when Edgar came back. He looked serious. The cars are ready, he said. Here are the keys. You can pick one. Nate took the keys and, with a thankful look on his face, went to the door. I followed him. I wanted to get away from the noise and the strange, heavy atmosphere that seemed to fill every part of the place. When we got to the mechanic's shop, we didn't see the car. Instead, there was a stout man with. I went to the door, and Nate followed me. I was happy to get out of the car and the strange, uncomfortable feeling that was in the air. When we got to the mechanic's shop, we didn't see the car. Instead, we saw the mechanic, a big man with a gray beard. He was cleaning his hands with a rag and looked up from under the hood of another car. He asked about your car. His voice had a regional accent. Yes, Nate, he said, looking worried. We were told that it was ready. The mechanic looked upset. It was supposed to be, but Edgar made a man with a beard looked up from under the hood of another car, wiped his hands on a rag, and asked about your car. His voice had a regional accent. Yes, Nate, he said, frowning. We were told it was ready. The mechanic's brow was wrinkled. It was supposed to be, but Edgar made a call. I said before that you wouldn't need it right away, so I didn't finish it. Nate's face went pale, and he clenched his fists. She agreed with the mechanic's casual response, apparently unaware of the strain in Nate's voice, and said that there had been a change of plans. I assumed you would stay. I said that you wouldn't need it right away, so I didn't finish the call. Nate's face went pale, and he clenched his fists. He followed the mechanic's casual response, not realizing that Nate was upset. He said that the plan had changed. I thought you would stay. For a while. The idea of spending another night in that place made my stomach hurt. It felt like a trap, like something was holding us back. Nate's face showed clear frustration and anger, but he kept it in check. Still, there was nothing we could do. Edgar's influence had decided our fate, making sure we stayed where we were. I felt uneasy at the thought of spending another night in that place. It felt like a trap, like something was holding us back. Nate looked annoyed, and he seemed angry, but he didn't say anything. Edgar was in charge, and he decided that we would stay at the inn for one more night. It felt like Edgar was even colder than usual when he greeted us. But his eyes showed that he was happy. "It looks like you're staying with us for a while," he said, sounding too happy. Nate ignored him. I asked more about it. The mood was more intense than usual. Edgar greeted us with a sneer, but his eyes showed he was happy. "You'll be staying with us for a while," he said, sounding too happy for comfort. Nate ignored him. I felt uneasy, and I walked quickly past our room. When I got to Nate's room, he closed the door and started pacing, looking like a trapped animal I didn't understand. He said that people destroy everything. What did he mean by following you? I asked, my voice quietly. Nate stopped, and his face showed confusion. Edgar and I were friends when I lived here, but the situation got worse over time. I think he never forgave me. I asked him to tell me everything because I thought it would help us understand what was going on. Nate stopped talking, looked away, and seemed upset. I asked him what was going on, but he just looked at me, and I couldn't tell if he was going to tell me something or not. He rubbed his face and let his shoulders drop. I had a strong connection to a woman who was also connected to Edgar. This made things complicated, and I saw that Edgar was angry and wanted to get revenge. It seemed like Edgar's confession was a big deal, but I realized that he was still holding back a lot of information. He rubbed his face and let his shoulders sag. He had an emotional connection to a woman who was involved with Edgar. This complicated things, and inappropriate things happened. Now, he wants to get revenge. His confession seemed to show that he was withholding other information. The strain in his voice suggested scars much deeper than he had admitted. "What will happen now?" I asked gently. He looked away, and his words were barely audible. "I'm not sure. I just know as long as we are here. Ed will not let me forget the evening I went to the dining room for a drink of water. The inn was almost empty, with just a few people here and there. But Edgar was there. He looked at me when I came in, and he walked towards me in a way that seemed like he wanted to attack me. "Mrs. Whitaker?" Edgar greeted me with a determined gaze as I entered the dining room for a drink of water. The inn was almost empty, with just a few people around. Yet Edgar was there. He looked at me intently when I came in. He walked towards me in a way that seemed dangerous. "Mrs. Whitaker spoke calmly, saying that she hoped Nate had not caused her much trouble. I looked at him, not wanting to play his game. "The things that happened between you two are not my business," he said. "But you're wrong. You're more involved than you think." I looked at him, determined to keep my cool. "Nate, I'm not going to get involved in your business," I said, trying to sound calm. "I don't want to know the details, especially the bad ones. I just want to protect you." Edgar looked at me, his eyes narrow, and said, "You think you know Nate, but you don't. He's keeping secrets from you, and you know it. He's using you." You perceived his words instilled a sense of dread. I wanted to turn and leave, but something unseen held me back. Edgar continued, his tone low and mocking. "He said that while you think you know him, Nate has secrets. These secrets are things he would never tell you. They make you question everything." I tightened my jaw. I was determined not to let him upset me. "Don't need you to tell me what to do, Edgar. Please leave me out of any problems you have with Nate." Edgar laughed without feeling happy. "I promise you, Mrs. Whitaker. I just want to protect you. There is a reason why he doesn't want to tell you the truth." I made myself leave. His words were still in my mind, though, when I made a tight smile. I was determined not to let him upset me. "I don't need you to tell me what to do, Edgar. Leave me out of it." Edgar laughed, sounding angry. "I promise you, Mrs. Whitaker. I just want to protect you. There's a reason why he's not telling you the truth." I forced myself to leave. But when I went back into the room, I still thought Edgar was right. Nate was acting strangely, and he was being secretive. He was hiding something from me that night. I lay awake, thinking about all this. I had so many questions, but I didn't know how to ask them. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, and the shadows were moving and changing. I felt uneasy, and I couldn't stop thinking about what Edgar had said. Nate was acting strangely, and he wouldn't talk about it. I had a lot of questions, but I didn't know how to ask them. I felt trapped, and I couldn't stop thinking about the mystery from the night before. The next morning, I found a note under the door. The writing was messy, but the message was clear. Meet me in the woods behind the inn at 10:00 a.m. I felt a sense of unease, as if I were trapped in a maze. Nate had confronted the act of crossing, and I urged you to understand the person you are defending. He informed me that he had confronted the act of crossing. The absence of a signature did not obscure the sender's identity. I stealthily exited the bed, aiming to avoid disturbing Nate. I donned my attire, my pulse racing as I exited the room and proceeded to the rear of the property. The trees loomed ominously ahead, their branches intertwining like undead fingers. I discovered Edgar awaiting my arrival. His demeanor was inscrutable. The absence of a signature did not hide the sender's identity. I quietly left the bed, trying not to bother Nate. I quickly got dressed, my heart beating fast as I left the room and went to the back of the property. The trees loomed ominously ahead, their branches intertwining like undead fingers. I found Edgar waiting for me. His attitude was mysterious. He said his tone was full of cynicism, and that it was brave of her to come alone. I simply asked him to explain his desires, firmly resisting any attempt at intimidation. He looked at me for a little while, his gaze intense. I urge you to understand the person you are defending. Nate is not who you think he is. He then told me that he had confronted the act of crossing. He told me he had confronted the act of crossing and recounted his actions. Nate appeared to be unsure whether to continue, even though he was involved in a sinister scheme that harmed others. He thought he could avoid it, but he was wrong. It was just a matter of time before it caught up with him. What specific allegations are you making against him? I asked, feeling a wave of. He described what he did, but he seemed unsure. I felt angry, and I looked at him with a cold smile. I asked him directly, but don't be surprised if he lies to you. That's what he's good at. He turned and left, leaving me alone in the clearing. His words hung in the air like a curse. When I returned to the room, Nate was awake. His eyes showed a mix of relief and mistrust. Where were you? He asked, his tone was strained. I went. I felt angry and upset, but I tried to stay calm. I told him that I went for a walk because I needed some fresh air. He looked at Lily, and I understood that he was suspicious of her. I told him that I had kept some information from him, but I needed his trust. I told him that even though Edgar said bad things about me, I knew that he was just trying to make us fight. I decided to go for a walk. I tried to speak calmly. I needed to get some fresh air. He looked at me closely, his eyes deep. Lily, I realize that things have been hard, and I'm sorry for not telling you everything. But I need you to trust me. Even though Edgar says he's just trying to make us fight, I know he's telling the truth. But I also feel like Edgar is being cautious. I want to trust Nate, too. He seemed honest, but I could see something else in his eyes, something he didn't want to share. I just want to understand. I said quietly, I want to help you, Nate, but I can't if you keep me out. He looked down, his fists clenched at his sides. Maybe. I still had questions, but I decided to trust Nate. He seemed honest, but I could tell he was keeping something from me. I just wanted to understand. I said to him, Nate, I want to help you, but I can't if you keep secrets from me. He looked down, his fists clenched at his sides. I knew he was hiding something, but I didn't know what. When we got back to Elmwood, I hoped he would tell me everything. But he only said he would tell me later. As we left Elmwood the next morning, we were both nervous and silent as we packed our things. When we returned, I was able to tell you everything. The answer was not what I wanted, but it was the only one he was ready to give. As we left Elmwood, I felt sure that the truth, whatever it was, would stay with us long after we left. The next morning, we left Elmwood. We were both nervous and silent as we put our things into the car. Nate hardly looked at me. He looked worried, like he was thinking hard. I felt like something bad had happened, and that we were leaving with more questions than when we started. What Edgar said was on my mind as I got in the passenger seat. He clearly wanted me to. Nate didn't look at me. He seemed worried. I felt like something bad had happened, and we were leaving with more questions than when we started. I thought about what Edgar said. He wanted me to ask Nate questions. I looked at Nate. I could see him, but I also saw that he was upset we went onto the highway. I looked at Nate. I wanted him to say something, but he was thinking hard. His hands were on the steering wheel. They were white because he was holding it so tight. Nate seemed distracted, and I felt uneasy. The trip felt long, and the quiet was uncomfortable. I wanted to say things and ask questions, but I couldn't. Every time I tried to speak, I felt held back, like I couldn't go back. In the end, I couldn't. The trip took a long time, and it was hard to talk to each other. I wanted to say a lot of things, but I couldn't. I thought about all the things I wanted to ask, but I couldn't. I tried to speak, but something stopped me. It felt like if I spoke, I couldn't go back. I tried to speak, but I couldn't. Nate, I started to speak, but I was very quiet. Back there, Edgar said some things about your past. He didn't answer. He looked at the road ahead. He said you were hiding information and hurting people. I didn't say anything. I was shaking. I needed to know if what he said was true. For a moment, I thought he might be right. I couldn't take it anymore, Nate. I started to speak, but I was too quiet. Back there, Edgar said some things about your past. He didn't respond, and he looked ahead. He said you were hiding things and hurting people. I was shaking, and I asked him to prove that it was true. For a moment, I thought he might not say anything. But then he breathed out deeply, and he let go of the wheel. Edgar started to speak, and he sounded angry and sorry. He said everything, even after all these years. I waited, my heart beating faster. In that moment, he said that he had a woman in his life before he met you in hell. The situation was complicated. She was. He didn't say anything, but he looked upset. He was holding the wheel tightly. After a long time, Edgar spoke. He sounded angry and sorry. He said that he had a lot of feelings for a woman even after all these years. I was very nervous, and my heart was beating very fast. He said that he had known this woman before he met you and how the situation was complicated. She was also connected to Edgar. This made things chaotic. He stopped, maybe thinking about what to say. We both thought we loved her, but it was more like an obsession. She controlled us, making us fight each other, and we accepted her control. Things got worse, and one night, Edgar and I fought. After that, she was gone forever. The situation became chaotic. Edgar and I were in the middle of it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I felt like I couldn't trust what I was thinking. I felt like I couldn't trust what Edgar was saying. I felt like I couldn't trust Nate. Things got really bad, and then Lily left. No one understands why people say I did something wrong, but I promise I didn't do it. I felt like I couldn't breathe. A lady had disappeared. Nate was in the middle of it all. I wanted to believe him and trust his honesty, but I still had doubts. As time went on, I tried to forget about what happened at Elmwood, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about what Edgar said and what Nate admitted. I started noticing small changes in Nate was in the middle of everything. I wanted to believe him and trust that he was telling the truth, but I still had doubts. As time went on, I tried to forget what happened at Elmwood, but I couldn't stop thinking about Edgar's warnings and Nate's confession. I started to notice small changes in Nate's behavior, like when he didn't smile and laugh like he usually did. One day, while we were sorting through some of his things, I found a box marked Nate. Inside, there were pictures and letters from when he was younger. There was a picture of him with a woman, but her face was hidden in shadow. Her hand was. Nate's demeanor was sometimes distant, and his eyes didn't show emotion when he smiled. One evening, as we were organizing some of his things, I found a box marked Nate. Inside was a picture of him with a woman from when he was younger. Her face was partly hidden, but her hand was clearly on his shoulder. My heart hurt when I looked at the picture. Was this the woman he had mentioned, the one who had helped him and Edgar? What had happened to her? I couldn't stop looking at the rest of the box. I wanted to find a clue, an explanation, but all I found were some old things. I looked closely at the picture on his shoulder. His fingers were interlaced with mine, and my heart hurt. Was this the lady he had mentioned? The one who had intervened between him and Edgar? What had truly happened with her? I looked at the rest of the package, seeking a clue, an explanation. But all I found were pieces of a life I barely knew, shards of a jigsaw I could not assemble that night. I spoke to Nate again, but I could not stay quiet anymore. Nate, I started. My voice was quiet. I found a photograph today of you with a woman. Is that her? He looked up, and his face showed sorrow and remorse. He spoke without emotion. Is that her? I was in a state of confusion and anger. I asked Nate, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you explain? He shook his head and looked down. I felt embarrassed. I thought I could hide it and move forward, but Edgar was still there, reminding me of what happened and how he saw my actions. I asked Nate, knowing the weight of his silence. He paused, an surge of wrath and treachery. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you explain? He shook his head and looked down. I felt embarrassed. I thought I could hide it and move on, but Edgar was still there, reminding me of what happened and how he saw my actions. I asked Nate, and he looked upset. One night, she left without saying goodbye or explaining anything. Edgar says I made her leave, but I promise I didn't do anything. His words hung in the air, full of unresolved tension. I wanted to believe him and trust his honesty, but I still had doubts, like a shadow in the back of my mind. As days turned into one night, she left without saying goodbye or explaining why. Edgar says I made her leave, but I promise I didn't do anything to make her leave. His words hung in the air, making me feel uneasy. I wanted to believe him and trust that he was telling the truth, but I still felt doubtful. As time went on, we slowly started to live our lives again, but I still remembered Elmwood, even though Edgar said it wasn't true and Nate said he was guilty. I watched Nate as he looked for proof to show if what I thought was true or not. But he stayed as distant as always and focused on his own thoughts. One evening, while I was making dinner, the doorbell rang. I opened the door. Weeks later, our lives slowly started to feel normal again. But I still thought about Elmwood, especially after Edgar said some things and Nate said he was wrong. I watched Nate, trying to prove or disprove what I thought, but he stayed distant, thinking about his own things. One night, while I was making dinner, the doorbell rang. I opened the door, and my heart stopped. It was Edgar. He was on the porch, smiling sadly, like he knew this would happen. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, his voice soft and mean. I think it's a good time to talk. I felt angry and scared. What are you doing here? I asked Natalie. He looked at me, his eyes shifting. The door and my heart stopped. It was Edgar. He stood on the porch, smiling sadly, like he had been waiting for this. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, his voice gentle and mocking. I think it's a good time to talk. I felt a strong wave of anger and fear. What are you doing here? I asked Natalie. He looked at the living room. There are several things we need to talk about before I answer. Nate appeared in the doorway, his face pale and tired. He looked at Edgar, his jaw tightened, and his hands clenched at his sides. Leave, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Edgar laughed as he entered the house, ignoring Nate's warning. Is that the right way to treat a long? There are several things we need to talk about before I answer. Nate came into the living room. He looked at Edgar, his face pale and tired. Nate's jaw was tight, and his hands were clenched at his sides. He looked at Edgar, his voice low and angry. Edgar laughed when he came into the house, ignoring Nate's warning. Is it okay to do that to a friend? Nate looked at Edgar, his eyes full of anger. I told you, Edgar, I don't want anything to do with you. Edgar smiled and looked at Nate. Does she know, Nate? Does she know what really happened? Nate's face looked angry as he walked toward Edgar, fists clenched. They fought, their bodies hitting each other in a big fight full of rage. Nate's eyes flashed with anger. Edgar, I don't want anything to do with you. I told you, Edgar. Is she acquainted with Nate? Does she know what really happened? Nate's face contorted with anger as he charged toward Edgar, fists clenched. They struggled, their bodies clashing in a whirlwind of rage and hostility. I tried to separate them, but they were trapped in an unceasing conflict. A fight made worse by years of betrayal and resentment. They finally separated, each gasping for breath. Their cheeks were red with anger. Nate said, with venomous intensity, "You can't escape this. You may believe you're innocent, but I know the truth, and so does she." He faced me, his gaze frigid and analytical. I asked him, "Mrs. Whitaker questioned him that night and asked him whether he would tell us the truth about what happened." He left suddenly, leaving us in a quiet that seemed as heavy and uncomfortable as a crypt. I faced Nate, my pulse pounding, and my mind full of questions. I asked him, my voice shaking, "Nate, what does he mean?" Mrs. Whitaker asked him questions that night, trying to find out what had happened. She left quickly, leaving us alone in a silent room that felt as dark as a tomb. I looked at Nate, my heart beating fast and my mind full of questions. I said, "Nate, what happened that night?" Why didn't he look at me? He looked away, his face pale and upset. I couldn't talk about it. I felt frustrated and sad. "Why won't you tell me the truth?" he said. My voice was quiet because I didn't know the truth myself. The next days were filled with silence and doubt. Nate left. That evening, he looked away. His face looked sad and worried. "I can't talk about it." I felt very frustrated and sad. "Why won't you tell me the truth?" he said. "I can barely hear you because I don't know the truth either." For the next few days, things felt strange. Nate went away. He looked sick and worried, like he was dealing with something really hard. I tried to make him feel better, but he didn't like it. One night, he left. I woke up and saw that his side of the bed was empty. The house felt really quiet and weird. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find him. I tried to make him feel better, but he didn't want me to. One night, he left, and I woke up to find his side of the bed empty. The house felt strange and quiet. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find him. I smelled his perfume, but that was all I could find. I called Edgar, hoping he would know something. But his voicemail was full, and I couldn't get through to him. I asked everyone in town if they had seen Nate, but no one said they had. I looked for Nate everywhere, but no one had seen him. It was like he had just disappeared. I felt alone and confused, and I couldn't stop thinking about him. I couldn't forget him, even though I tried to move on. I felt like I was stuck in a dead end. It felt like he had left, but I still had questions and felt bad. As time went on, I started to feel like Nate was still around, even though I couldn't stop thinking about him. I tried to move on, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Sometimes at night, I would hear a sound, like a soft knock on the door, and I would think about if it was Nate coming back to finish something he started. But every time, it just ended with quiet, and I was left with these thoughts about a story that wasn't finished.